Okay, welcome everybody to the sixth episode of the Hogtown podcast. And in fact, our first podcast episode where we have a guest who's one of my favorite authors and economists and bloggers and tweeters, Bryan Caplan from George Mason University. So thank you, Bryan, for joining us on the podcast.
Great to be here.
This podcast, which is new, although we've gotten a pretty good and growing following here, just to give you a little bit of background, we started it to talk about Toronto specifically, and Toronto's ascent, or maybe kind of like ambition for an ascent as a global city.
Is Toronto nicknamed Hogtown?
Toronto has been nicknamed Hogtown. It was more true in the past. So at one point
I
in
thought
history,
you were in Texas or something.
No. Yeah, Toronto, Canada. We're up here in Toronto, Canada, where we had, I guess, like a large number of slaughterhouses at some point.
All right.
Now, if you Google Hogtown, we're not the only city to have been called Hogtown. London, England, at some point was Hogtown. I guess they slaughtered pigs in a lot of cities, but we were Hogtown at some point too. So it is a lot about Toronto, but I mean, most of what we end up talking about is housing policy because you know, of course, that there's this housing affordability crisis across the continent, but it's certainly true of Toronto, which I think is one of the most expensive markets, especially relative local incomes. So we spend a lot of time talking about this. And maybe just to kick this off, I think it's interesting. We talk about Toronto's ascent as a global city. As far as I can tell, there are two kind of main ingredients to this. The first is you need to let a lot of smart people into your country. And then second, you need to build a lot of housing or have permission to build a lot of housing in whatever city you want to become a global city. This book, which we're going to talk about, your new book, Build, Baby, Build, is your second graphic novel. And the first one, Open Borders, was like on the first question of whether or not we should let more people into a country. And this one's about building more housing in cities. So I find that it fits perfectly. So maybe to kick this off, you could tell us a little bit about why, I know you've written other books, but why for this specific medium, this graphic novel medium, you landed on these two topics.
Here's the thing. In both topics, there is this amazing research with big conclusions, with broad implications, and yet the papers are really boring to read and hardly anyone will ever read them. So as an educator, I spend quite a bit of time thinking about how can I actually take what's known and package it in such a way that people want to read it, and also where the individual pieces, which might not mean very much by themselves, when you put them together, you can see what's going on. Normally professors, they just make a brick. They make one brick, there's my brick, and then they leave it there, and that's how they make their careers. That doesn't really actually do very much with the knowledge. What I'd like to do in these books especially is to take a lot of knowledge that's out there and assemble it into a package that's meaningful, that people would actually want to read. Also, in particular for this housing book, I really was focused on the idea a lot of opposition to new construction is just aesthetic. People think it'll be ugly. I said, well, how about we just go and draw this alternate world, and then you can see for yourself if you think it's ugly. I think it looks pretty good.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I guess in that case, what you're trying to do with this is more than just highlight the academic research that's been conducted, but to change minds, to win friends and influence people. And it does feel like an important medium. I mean, since the publishing,
to do it honestly, I really that's very important to me. The normal thing, if you just want to change minds, you just lie and make stuff up, and I don't want to do that.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. So maybe to like set the tone, then maybe you could tell us a little bit about. Again, we talk a lot about Toronto's context specifically and how our restrictive land use rules constrain housing supply, and therefore we have less housing than we otherwise might, and it's more expensive than it might otherwise be. Maybe you could set the scene for us. What is the problem here? How big of a problem is it? And then we could start diving into what you propose as maybe a better way to run the world.
Right. Here's the issue. Obviously, it takes resources to produce housing, and it's never going to be free in any kind of sensible world. But there's a question of, should it really be as expensive as it is? All right. Well, if it's just based upon physical costs, the actual land, the actual construction, then you can fairly say, well, it's just too bad. That's life. On the other hand, though, if you've got all the physical materials that you need, but you just don't have government permission to build, then first of all, you can reasonably say, that's something where it's an artificial scarcity. It's not really something that's hard to do. It's just something the government makes hard to do. And then also it means that you are going to get prices that are pushed well above the cost of production and to stay there. And here's a basic way about how markets work. If demand goes up, prices go up. But when they go up, that means the prices are above average cost. And when prices are above average cost, that tells business that they can make money really easily. Just make more and you will make a profit. So the normal thing that has happened in housing markets, as well as most markets, is that in the past, when prices would go up, there'd be a period of high price, or there'd be this period of high prices, but that would induce a lot more construction. And eventually that extra construction would bring prices back down to the cost of production at a higher quantity level. And this is really how housing markets generally worked in the US and Canada and most other countries until the 70s or 80s. But since then, the housing regulation has gotten so draconian, so strict in so many ways that housing prices just stayed way above the cost of production. They don't always rise. There was a fall after the Great Recession, but in the US, we're back up to 12% higher than the very peak of 2006, adjusting for inflation. So things are now worse than ever.
Now, why do you think these regulation were ramped up in the 60s and 70s? And it seems to me that this is especially true of like Commonwealth countries, Anglosphere countries. I mean, we've been building and living in housing for our entire history as humans. Like, what would change? Why did we start regulating these things in the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's like the general story I have is that regulation exists because it's popular. It's popular because people think that it makes things better than it would be without the regulation. But when you think about it, it says, well, but has that changed a lot? I mean, I'd say that we have gotten just a lot more sympathetic to listening to complainers. Right. That is an actual change over time. That when someone says, I don't like something about this project, in the past, it's like, yeah, well, that's life. People don't like stuff, whatever. We're still building it anyway, and you can't stop it. And in more recent decades, governments have gotten very responsive to complainers and treated them as if they are the voice of the people, which they totally are not. It's a very tiny, self-selected, psychologically abnormal group of people that try to stop construction, but they punch way above weight. In the US, actually, in the 60s, the federal government started pushing lower levels of government to have more community involvement, which again is never going to actually happen in the sense of most people are never going to be involved in anything. Community involvement is a code word for letting local busybodies get a lot of influence. And that is something that has changed. It's also probably true to say that the regulation just grows and grows. In my book, I talk about the slippery slope. The slippery slope, by definition, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a while before you keep piling regulation onto regulation. There were a bunch of regulations in the past, but they just weren't that big of a deal, and builders were able to just get around them, or they didn't cost that much. It's in recent years that it's gotten to this horrible state where it, as I show in the book, at least for the U.S., housing prices are probably at least double their cost of physical production now.
Right. Now, you mentioned a part of this is higher levels of government pushing more of these decisions to more local bodies, which is interesting because I think a lot of people that have kind of like a pro-market, pro-free enterprise perspective, they have this general affinity for subsidiarity. The idea that because local knowledge is so important in an economy, you actually want decision-making and governance to be as close to the people or as close to the thing being decided on as possible. But it seems to me that there might be an exception here where, like in this case, the local knowledge might be negative because it might be kind of like overweighting the complainers as opposed to the people who might benefit from housing.
Yeah, that's very reasonable. I mean, I recently just gave a talk on why local government is really overrated, and there's just a lot of things that local governments do that are obviously ridiculous. Right. So, I would say that we should seek truth from facts. And so if you think that local government works better, look at local governments and see if it works better. Right. For me, like the most obvious signs of local government incompetence are underpricing of parking. If you go to a local area and it's all parked up, and either it's parking's free, so you can't get it, or they just charge a nickel per day to go and park there. This is very typical of local governments, and it's obvious mismanagement. It means that you are wasting resources on people who don't appreciate them that much. As to why they do it, it's basically democracy in action. Democracies do what people think is a good idea. Whether it is a good idea or not is not actually very important. What really matters is just what sounds good.
Right. Now, so when we talk about these land use rules that constrain housing supply, we almost take it for granted, and I'm saying we as on this podcast, that this contributes to kind of like a slower supply response to rising
Mm-hmm.
prices and rising demand, and therefore
Mm-hmm.
we don't see the moderation on prices that we might otherwise have. I mean, one thing that we hear from people who kind of like challenge this is the idea that we're suggesting that for housing to be more affordable, we need to build more new housing. And then
Mm-hmm.
some people say, I've noticed that new housing is actually quite expensive,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe even more expensive than anything else. So how is it, what's the mechanism here that allows for us building more expensive housing, contributing to affordability generally?
Yeah, great question. One of the most basic lessons of economics is you've got to look at indirect effects as well as direct effects. In the case of housing, it's very relevant. Because what happens if you go and build some new housing, especially if you're in a high price area? Yeah, you are going to go and build some nice fancy housing, and the people who move into that are going to be high income people. To understand the broader effects on affordability, though, you then have to say, okay, well, the places that the people move from, who's going to live there? Well, if the very richest people move into the brand new places, it's going to be people who are less rich who move into the places they were occupying. Who's going to move into the places that are occupying by that group of movers? Other people who are poorer, and so on. There's this big chain reaction. What I call it in the book is reverse musical chairs. Normal musical chairs, you have a fixed number of chairs and you start taking them away.
Right.
But construction is more like adding chairs. And so even if it's going to be the best players that wind up in the nicest chairs, still just by adding more nice chairs, that means there's less competition for the cheaper chairs. And so it's just easier to get someplace, even though it's not the very best. I know this sounds to a lot of people, it's just some ideology or something. It's really not. It's just basic common sense. Think about it like this. If you go and look at the vintage of the housing that people of different income levels occupy, you'll generally see that richer people live in the newer stuff. Poorer people live in the older stuff. Now, here's the key thing to think about. If you go and see that the average person with an income of 50,000 Canadian dollars is living in housing that was built 20 years ago, you got to say, well, what if 20 years ago we'd listened to people like you and we hadn't built this stuff? Because of course that stuff was going to be nicer when it was first built. The natural thing is that stuff deteriorates, and then, yes, it goes from something that's luxury to something that's not so luxurious. You can do maintenance to try to counteract that, but still, people with lower income, they live in older stuff. And the reason why they can live in older stuff is that it was built in the past, normally for people that were richer in the past, but then it filters down. And so this is called a filtering effect. Let's say, like, out of people that have looked at the actual facts, it's not controversial. I know that there's just a lot of mistrust, and it's like, what are you really trying to pull here? You're trying to trick us somehow. And it's like, look, how do you think that 20-year-old housing got built? It was built 20 years ago because we didn't listen to people who said it wouldn't matter.
Right. And so people who don't buy into that logic, either because they haven't thought about it or had it explained to them as you just have, or because there's some mental block or kind of like ideological pride that prevents them from getting there. What we hear instead is that the way to ensure affordability is either through something like a price control, let's say rent control on rental housing, or through some mandated requirement for below market rate units. So inclusionary zoning, something like that. So you touch on this in the book.
Yes.
And maybe you could speak as to what, like, why that might not be necessary, but maybe even like not even desirable.
Right. Yeah. So rent control is one of the craziest ideas that has ever been cooked up in housing policy. I mean, here's the thing. Look, the problem is people don't want to build enough. So people aren't building enough stuff. How is saying that you can't make money building stuff going to solve that problem? The best case scenario is it just means that you're shuffling people around in an existing number of units. It's not solving any problem of housing availability. It's just making it cheaper. When you make things cheaper, you make it harder to get. You don't make it easier to get. But then that's actually really optimistic, because normally when you go and have rent control, it means that there are reduced incentives for further construction. There's reduced incentives for maintenance. The economist S.R. Lindbeck has this quote that I put into the book saying, rent control is the next best thing to bombing if you want to destroy a city. All right. So that one's pretty crazy. The mandating affordable units, basically that amounts to a tax on new construction. Right. And when you have a tax on new construction, what do? Well, you discourage further construction. Right. And it's important to remember that precisely when there's a pile of regulation that you have to get over in order to build something, it's a big deal if you make it less profitable. The reason why anything gets built despite the incredible draconian regulation is that developers are there saying, if I can get all 73 pieces of paperwork, then I'll be rich. In order to go and get over those 73, to get those 73 kinds of paperwork, you're going to wind up burning a lot of resources, but at least it's motivating. At the end of the day, there is light. Right? At the end of the tunnel, there is light. When you go and start piling on further burdens on developers saying they have to go and build a bunch of money-losing units, this is reducing the incentive to go and build more stuff. So it may wind up giving you more of that exact kind, but it is not a solution to the general problem of having more housing available. It's another thing that makes housing less attractive to build. Again, you didn't mention the one that I think is probably the most attractive, and I'll say it's the least stupid, and that's just having the government build housing.
Yeah.
Least government build housing. If they finish, it's housing.
Right.
All right. So they have in fact made housing more available. And by that same logic of filtering I was telling you, well, if people with lower income move into that government housing, that means it's going to be easier for people who are in the private market to go and get their housing. All right. So what's wrong with government housing? Basically, it's just the track record. It's a track record of having much higher costs than the private sector, having worse maintenance than the private sector. You can say we're going to fix those problems, but I say, first of all, there are simple reasons why these problems exist, which is when something's run by the nonprofit sector, they do a bad job.
Yeah.
It's just the real world. It's not, again, this is not ideology. This is not something that you have to have a certain philosophy in order to believe. It's what anybody who's spending their own money believes.
Yeah.
You're spending your own money. You're spending your own money. It doesn't matter. I don't care how much of a socialist you are. You want, someone says, oh, let's just go into the government run restaurant. It's just as good. It's like, yeah, I don't think it's just as good. It's going to be worse. And I'm not going to get such a good deal. Right. So in the US, it's totally standard for wealthy liberals to send their kids to fancy private schools and then say that school choice is a bad idea. It's like, well, but when you're spending your own money, you don't want to go to a public school, do you? In fact, you could either spend a pile of your own money or get public schooling for free. You want to spend a pile of money for the private schooling. It seems like you don't believe your own philosophy of markets are bad and governments are good. Seems like you actually think the opposite. And that's what's going on with public housing. In the book, I talk about the main talking point of pro-public housing people, which is Singaporean public housing. Yeah. I actually had already written a paper on Singapore, so I know something about it. The main thing is that Singaporean public housing is so different from public housing in almost every other country that it barely even qualifies. The main thing is the government builds it and then they sell it to you. And then you have every personal incentive to go and maintain it and improve it so that when you move, you can sell it for a high price. It's not like what we have here where you just get a low rent and then whatever happens, happens.
Yeah. So Singapore, I actually lived in Singapore for a short stretch. So it's something like 80% of the housing is owned by the government, but they do sell it to you. The way in which they sell it to you is through a 99-year lease. So they maintain title ownership, but effectively, for a human lifespan, you effectively do own it and do have these incentives. I guess a fourth route here, and school choice is probably the right analogy, is Section 8 in the U.S. at least. So for Canadians who don't know what Section 8 is, basically it's a housing voucher that you receive from the government that can be applied to private rental housing. So rather than the government either requiring below market rate housing from private developer or building social housing or imposing price caps, they just give you kind of like a subsidy that you could apply to private market housing. So how do you see that fitting into the mix? Again, if the analogy is school choice, it sounds like probably better than some of these other solutions.
Well, let's see. I'd say that out of all of the ones that we mentioned of government doing something, government housing is the only one that actually builds stuff. So I'd still say that one gets the gold star of the bad stars anyway. I mean, so the thing about the housing voucher is, it solves the problem of the person who gets the voucher. But it doesn't solve the problem of housing availability. If you were to go and give a big voucher to every poor person, then there's the issue of, well, how are other people going to be able to afford housing? Where are they supposed to live? So it basically is one where it solves the symptom,
right?
But without solving the root problem of just lack of housing availability. And it's one where you are just focused on, does this particular person have a place to live? That's one of the easiest problems to solve. The problem of, do people in general have good options? That's something that's hard to solve, or at least it seems hard to solve until you realize you can just go and take a flamethrower to a bunch of books of regulations, and then the market solves the problem.
Yeah, I guess where Section 8 might, like, you might get optimistic about it is that at least aligns interests. So if the government's paying market rate, or like a subsidy that is some percentage of market rate, it makes the government start thinking, what can we do to reduce the market rate? And this is not true of rent control. This is not true of inclusionary zoning. So social housing, there's a similar aligning of interest where, public builders, they butt up against these zoning constraints, in the same way that private developers do. So at least you're kind of hopefully starting to row in the same direction, right? That's kind of like the optimistic take.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine it. My general view is that with government policy, normally each policy is being set by different parts of the government. They don't coordinate. They're barely even aware the other ones are around. So the idea that if we have housing vouchers, the government will get its act together and deregulate. I mean, that seems, I guess it's possible, but sounds wildly optimistic in my book. I think the more likely scenario is that it's just two different programs. Like when you hear about things like both taxing tobacco farms and subsidizing them, that's not done by the same part of the government. It's different parts of the government, just each with a different mission.
Right. And to your point, there's this kind of like free lunch. You could just take a red pen and like rewrite some paperwork, and then you would see an increase in supply and downward pressure on prices.
Right. The issue is that there's a bunch of people who'll be screaming at you when you go and get rid of the regulations because they think the sky's going to fall. Right. If you think that the sky's really going to fall, then you can't do it.
So I mean, the more you dig into it, then, so there are all these kind of like technical solutions for how and where and when you should liberalize land use rules, but it does come down to this incentive that elected officials have to respond to the concerns of their constituents, most of whom might have a status quo bias and not want to see more housing built. You have a colleague who wrote another book called 10% Less Democracy. How much of this is just a problem with democracy? Is that like a fair framing? Or you also mentioned that the loudest voices are not represented of the majority. So like, where do you fall on that question?
That's a good question. So I mean, here's the interesting thing about U.S. politics anyway. People are most interested in federal politics, then state, and local is the least. If you look at turnout in purely local elections where there's no higher level of government that's on the ballot, then it's usually rock bottom, like 5 or 10%. Right. So to say that it's a problem with democracy per se, it's like, well, the problem isn't that everyone's participating or anything like that. It's not so. If you just say, well, that democracy is whatever we call democracy, then you say, well, the problem is that this is a system where a pretty small number of people who claim to speak for everybody wind up having a lot of power. Normally, people are complaining about business having extra power. And this is a common complaint about local and state politics, especially, is that it's so boring for most people that businesses are able to go and get their way. At least in the case of construction, my view is that lobbying is almost entirely good.
Right.
Because what's special about the construction industry is the whole business model is you get permission to make something, you build it, and then you sell it. And then you no longer actually you don't have any reason to want to stop further construction. You want to get more construction. Most industries, the industry would like to keep competition out. In the case of construction, the main thing is to be able to do it at all. So, I seriously think that if it were not for the construction industry lobbying local government for permission to do stuff, then we barely get anything built. It's that, what would be called corruption, right? Of course, heavily offset by community activists going and saying that it's terrible that they're going to go and destroy a bird's nest or block somebody's light or someone else or you might have a party and then there'd be a parking problem, like all of the standard complaints that people have about allowing anyone to do anything.
So there is a lot of lobbying in construction and development, and this is kind of there's like the stereotype of the developer who has politicians in his pocket and so on. But it does seem to me that these residents associations, these NIMBYs, these constituents who oppose housing are obviously winning that fight. If you track prices and if you track patterns of development. Yeah. So there is this idea of Tullk's Paradox, where given the returns to lobbying, we should expect to see much more lobbying. I do think that applies to development, and especially in a coordinated way. I know a lot of developers. I work in development. A lot of developers lobby for specific issues or bottlenecks or constraints on their specific site. Yeah. But there's not a lot of this kind of like broad-based, let's just clear the clutter. Let's take the flamethrower and torch all this paperwork. And is this a paradox in your mind? And if so, like, how do you resolve it?
Well, I think you were getting very close to the resolution of the paradox, which is that there is this big free rider problem with improving the system generally.
Right.
So therefore, there's very little in the way of donations to trying to make things better generally. Instead, it's just much easier to say, all right, forget about whatever the rules are, whatever the rules are going to be, but let me get a variance. Let me be the one person that's allowed to do this. I think this is going on throughout the entire system, actually. So for people that are trying to stop things, normally their goal is not to go and shut down construction in the entire city. Normally they're focused on this particular thing, right? They don't want someone to be able to go and build a parking lot in their exact neighborhood. Now this is pretty striking if you think that the point of NIMBYs is just to maximize the property values, because consider this. If you want to go and protect your property values, what's more important to shut down? Construction across the street from you or construction in your entire town?
Right. No, I think...
So you'd rather shut down construction in the entire town if you just want to have high prices.
That's right.
But on the other hand, if it's more emotional about, I don't like that one thing that I see that's just rubbing me the wrong way happening, then you're going to go and focus on the new development across the street from you. And I said, that's actually what most lobbying is about.
Well, and even the shutting development in the entire town, I do think that like risks backfiring for some NIMBYs, because at some point, kind of like the economic opportunity passes your town over if it's just too hard to do business in your town. But I think you're right. I think that this personal property value,
we can imagine this it coming back, and they say, "Oh no, we've made a terrible mistake." But like, what highly regulated housing market is there where people in the town have said, "Oh my God, we've made a terrible mistake"?
That's right. That's right.
What's pretty striking, the places that are easy to build are the places that have always been easy to build. So in the places where NIMBY referenda lose, or Houston, where they just haven't had it. If they had managed to pass it, probably it just would have kept accreting and getting worse and worse. But you nip it in the bud. It's not that things get so bad that eventually you look in the mirror and say, I've made a terrible mistake. Instead, it's if you just don't get started at all screwing things up, then things are okay. And otherwise, they just get worse and worse. That's the main thing we see, honestly.
Yeah, I think status quo bias, nostalgia, and ultimately maybe like a fear of dying is at the root of this. Like the more your neighborhood is changing, maybe the older you are or you're getting and the closer you are to death. I don't know if I'm psychoanalyzing too much, but I think like a purely like property value motive is like not quite capturing what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just the idea of like things are nice now. They should always stay this way forever, no matter what.
Right. That's right. That's right.
I mean, I think also a huge factor is just economic illiteracy. In the book, I go over this research where they just ask people, what do you think will happen if there's a big increase in housing supply? And about 2/3 of people don't believe prices will go down.
Right.
They just say, no, it won't. That's philosophy. That's ideology. And it's like, isn't it common sense? And I think for most people, what they're thinking is that the free market view is that if we're nice to builders, they'll be grateful and they'll cut prices out of gratitude.
Right.
That's the actual model people have. Like we go and approve it, and then they say, "Oh, you're so nice to let us build stuff. In response, we will go and make the prices low." But that is not the textbook story at all. The textbook story is rather, if you let people build, then out of total greed, once they have a bunch of new places that they want to sell or rent, they will say, well, how can I do it? How can I do it? It's like, I can't fill them all at existing prices. What could I do? How about if I cut the price? So people, they're not cutting the prices as a favor. They're cutting the prices because it's a way to make more money, which again is not a weird idea at all. It's not an ideological idea. Everybody knows that if you want to sell something, you can set a price so high that you actually don't make any money at all because you don't have any customers. And if you want to get the customers, you got to cut prices. And the argument for deregulation is that very argument. Let them build so that they feel the pressure to cut prices.
Yeah, and the economic illiteracy, of course, extends beyond, let's say, like NIMBY voters to the urban planning profession who like ultimately put the pen to paper on a lot of these regulation. I don't know. Have you read Alain Berthaud's Order Without Design?
I don't think so.
Okay, so big recommend. Do you know who he is? He's at the Mercatus Center.
Okay, so in that case, maybe I do know him. I was thinking that he was from 200 years ago.
No, he's fantastic. So he is and was an urban planner. He worked in cities across the world, including for, I believe, the World Bank. And now he's in Manhattan. He's at the Mercatus Center. And the rare urban planner who thinks like an economist. And he has this great book, Order Without Design, which, you know, from his title, I guess you could kind of like, just like Hayekian, like bottom up sort of thing. And the way he put it in a podcast is that urban planners think in terms of what they think you want or need. So this is where they set requirements for like indoor amenity space requirement, minimum unit sizes, all this stuff. Whereas economists think in terms of prices and the signals they send. And it's striking to me that when you speak to urban planners, when you listen to them, when you see the policies that they've passed, there's zero consideration for prices as signals for what, you know, society might want or need.
Yeah, so a lot of it's very static. I think another big issue is that people sit around coming up with complaints about everything that could go wrong if you build something new. Often the complaints are somewhat plausible, but people almost never think about the positives that'll come. And like, if all you do is come up with reasons not to do something, then yeah, you're going to say that you shouldn't do it. And yet we have very strong evidence that the positives of living around other people outweigh the negatives. What is the evidence? Well, go down to New York City and ask people about everything wrong with their lives. And they got a long list. Like, oh, there's the traffic, there's the parking, there's the noise, blah, 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 blah. All right, fine. Well, I got a real easy solution for you. Pack up and move to the middle of nowhere, and then you will not have to deal with any problems of traffic or parking or noise ever again. People know this. This is totally doable. You'll save a pile of money, and yet people don't want to do it. Why? Because there's a bunch of good things about living where they are that they almost never talk about. It's very unusual to go and meet someone on the street and just start saying, you know what I love about the city? I love all the wonderful things that we get by being here. It's just so fantastic and lovely. It's way better and it totally outweighs the traffic, parking, and noise problems. That's not the way that human beings talk. It's not the way that politicians or regulators or planners talk. But still, actions speak louder than words. This is what people show with their behavior, that they would pay a large amount of extra money to get a package of all the good stuff that people bring and all the bad stuff, and they value the package overall as a big positive.
Yeah, we point that out in terms of travel patterns, right? Manhattan has the benefit over Toronto where it hit its growth spurt before the 60s and 70s, so before a lot of this regulation started restricting development. We're hitting our growth spurt really over the last 20 years when this regulation is really established. But you know, people, when they travel, when they go on vacation, they go to places like Manhattan, they go to Barcelona, they go to London, they go to these cities that have a built form that they then return home to oppose and to fight. So it is kind of like a weird disconnect that you notice.
Yeah. I mean, there's the notion of, well, it's a nice place to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there. But then it's like, well, a lot of people seem to want to live there. How do you explain that?
Right. On the question of lobbying and this lack of coordination for like citywide reform, we have seen over the last maybe 10 years, this YIMBY movement, this yes in my backyard, pro-development, pro-housing supply movement step in. I've been following this very closely. My impression was that the YIMBY movement has been one of the most successful political movements. It's kind of cross-partisan. It's not captured, yet by any like strong ideological brand. And it's had policy successes in different states and different municipalities. Now, when reading your book, you mentioned that despite all of this and despite the rhetoric, I think shifting in a much more pro-supply direction, like by most measures, housing regulation has increased across the board, like over the last 5-6 years.
Well, in particular, what I show is that by recent measures, there's not a single high regulation place in 2006 that got less.
Right. And
so
there are some
easily there are places that got less, but there are places where hardly anybody lives, so it doesn't really help many people. But yeah, that is the issue. Like there have been a number of successes. There have been big moves against single family zoning in California, Oregon, Minnesota. Although honestly, usually like the more closely I study the successes, the more disappointed I am. Like California officially gets rid of single family zoning, but if you read the fine print, one of the rules is that when you split your house up into more houses, you have to keep occupying your house during the construction.
Yeah.
So it's like, wouldn't it make more sense just to sell to a developer? Well, California, the lawmakers, they actually said, no, we want to make sure that the owner gets the gain. So we don't want to let them be able to sell out, which makes about as much sense as saying that if you discover oil on your land, you should have to drill it yourself. You shouldn't be able to go and subcontract to someone who actually knows how to drill oil, because otherwise they would get the profit. Right. And if you think about it a bit more, it's saying, that doesn't make any sense. It's the person who owns it who benefits from the asset. And then the reason why you have someone else do it is because it's easier for you. That's the real reason. But I think the actual story here is that this is sort of a poison pill put into the legislation to make sure that we don't actually have a whole lot of extra housing that gets built.
Yeah, what I notice is you have these municipal councilors who used to only have their NIMBY constituents to cater to, and now they have these young YIMBYs to cater to. And the way they kind of like balance this is they find these policy changes, let's say inclusionary zoning, that allows them to rhetorically say that they care about this issue and that they're doing something about it in a way that will not actually lead to more development and more construction. So it's like the poison pill concept, I think, is exactly right, and is not kind of like by accident. This is like a very deliberate policy choice to be able to like have the right rhetoric, but actually not lead to too much destabilizing development or whatever in their neighborhoods.
Yeah, in terms of the current politics of it, I would say that YIMBYs definitely lean quite left. They're a very special part of the progressive coalition that understands supply and demand on this issue, so that's great. Yeah. But if you want to look at places that actually have the best housing policy, it's places like Texas where they don't really have much of a movement. They just never had much regulation, and then they didn't change very much. And strikingly to me, people in places like Texas, they don't sit around saying, oh, we're so great because we have great housing policy. They just sort of take it for granted that housing is going to be affordable. Like if, in a way, I think it would be good if you could just get people in Texas to start looking down on California and saying, well, they say that they're so wonderful, but look at what they do. Like in Texas, a working person can actually afford a decent home, not in California. And it's because of the Texas way that we have where we don't regard developers as criminals. Yeah. So to go and take something that's being done by default and try to turn it into something people are doing in principle, that's kind of at least one of the things that I'm aiming for in this book.
Right. We have an interesting dynamic here in Canada where federally we have a leader of the Conservative Party who kind of like really broke on the scene with this remove the gatekeepers slogan. And it was specifically targeted at municipal gatekeepers who block housing development and this kind of like broader idea of autocracy and so on. So really like took the YIMBY mantle, but now we have a liberal party that's really falling in the polls that are basically like mimicking a lot of that messaging. So we have like a cross-partisan consensus, at least rhetorically. The policy is not quite there, but I think that's at least somewhat encouraging.
I mean, it's hard, but here's the thing is to really favor deregulation, you've actually got to say some things and act on them that sound ugly to people. Like you've got all these complaints and like, we're just not going to worry about them. Like these plates are too petty. They're too small. And like you may not like it, but that's too bad. I often think about, so they like in DC, there's, one of our airports is Reagan Airport. And I remember something like half of all the noise complaints been filed by one person.
Yes. Yeah. I saw that. That was Eli Dorado, I think.
Like when you see something like this, it's like, all right, so really what we're going to say to that person is we've heard enough from you. We never want to hear your complaints again. If you don't like it, too bad. And people like you are not going to we don't need to make you feel any better. Like enough is enough. There's no pleasing you. Go away. Yeah. I think that's the mentality that you really need to actually deregulate a lot, is just to no longer say, of course, we need to go and handle every complaint and consider it in a sensitive and serious way. You need to be much more willing to just be dismissive and say, like, yeah. All right, enough's enough. All right, moving on.
I've been reading your blog for a very long time, and I remember you had a post, it might have been quite a long time ago, it was like, not my problem is an underrated response to a lot of these things.
Yes.
It's like, there's going to be more people parking on my street, not my problem. That sort of
tough. I think it was tough luck.
Oh, that's what it was. That's what it was. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's one where I think we do have a good solution, which is charge for parking.
Yeah.
That's one where we've got a totally feasible solution. We have the technology, we can do it, but people have so much resentment against having to pay anything to park. Even if you say, look, we could make housing way cheaper, make driving and parking a bit more expensive, it's a great deal. And no. Parking and driving must be totally free. That's what's required by the fundamental principles of justice. Housing can be $1 million a house. That's okay. No big deal.
Right. One of the reasons why we like talking about housing, and one of the reasons I think you wrote this book, is because housing is actually about much more than housing. There's this great piece by Sam Bowman that you might have read. I think it was in the Works in Progress magazine, The Housing Theory of Everything. And you have...
No, I have it. That sounds good.
Oh, it's very good. I mean, it's very similar to your panacea policy chapter. So maybe talk to us a little bit about like having housing be more affordable is about more than just like paying less for housing. There are all these kind of like second order effects that are great.
Yeah. I mean, this is actually why I wrote the book. If it was just deregulate housing, prices go down. All right, that's not really not much of a book. But what I realize is there's a lot of other issues that seem really unrelated to housing, and yet once you understand the connection between regulation and prices and other things, then it all falls into place. People complain a lot about inequality. Well, let's see. Housing is a necessity. Almost everybody spends money in housing. So, if you were to go and reduce the price, it would be especially good for the poor because they spend a higher share of their income on housing than the rich do. So deregulating housing reduces inequality. Deregulating housing raises social mobility because when housing prices are low in high-wage areas, you can just go and move to a high-wage area and get a better life for yourself, which is how the United States anyway used to work. I assume Canada is the same. Yeah. Whereas today now, if you move from Mississippi to San Francisco, you'll probably go and have a fall in your standard of living because the extra housing cost will exceed 100% of your salary gain. Let's see, some other things I talk about, fertility. Big reason why people don't have kids is because they can't afford to get their own place. Probably better to reverse it. Think about this. One of the main reasons people keep living with their parents into adulthood is because housing's so expensive.
Yeah.
If you are living with their parents, you're not very likely to get married, and you're even less likely to have any kids. If you could go and make housing cheaper, people would move out of their parents' houses at a younger age, and then family formation begins at an earlier time. Of course, this does depend upon the idea that fertility is too low, but I think people are finally coming around on that being a really serious medium-run problem. Maybe too late to avert some really bad stuff from happening, or at least for South Korea, but still. So get housing prices down and probably make a dent in fertility. And let's see, a bunch of other ones I can talk about if you want.
On the fertility point, and then maybe we'll get into some of the other ones. So you wrote another great book, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids. I think you're fairly pronatal, I think is the term. You think having kids is a good idea, and I do too. One thing you hear from kind of like reactionary elements, like the right wing of the NIMBY contingent, is that people have fewer kids in high density cities with high rise buildings and these sort of things. And there's like maybe a pretty clear correlation that could be drawn here, if not a causation. To the extent that I'm like completely sold on all of this, including the idea that, I used to live in a 1-bedroom apartment. I had to move to a 2-bedroom apartment to have my first and second kid. We then moved to a 3-bedroom apartment to have my third kid. I've lived this. But do you think there's anything to that concern that like this, this form of living is just not conducive to people wanting to or ultimately having kids?
I'd say there's a lot to it. You just need to unpack what's really going on. Look, here's the thing. Why does someone live in a 1-bedroom apartment? Is this people's dream? Is it your first choice? If you were a billionaire, would you live in a 1-bedroom apartment? Highly unlikely. The reason why people live in high density housing is because housing is expensive. That's the main reason. All right. So when you go and take a look at Hong Kong or Macau or Tokyo and say, look, people live in these tiny places and, why? People don't like living in these tiny places. Like it may be their best trade-off given current circumstances. But if you were to deregulate, prices would be a lot lower. And then people get elbow room. And then suddenly the thing that they want changes. So I would say that focusing on density per se is just a weird starting point. The obvious thing is the density is caused by the high prices. Get the prices down, and then, at least in a relevant sense, density will go down. Now, as to what that exactly means, could mean that people would rather live in a single-family home, might mean that they want to have an enormous apartment. So I was, there's this one guy that was arguing with me on Twitter, and he was saying, how housing in Macau is cheap, and I'm like, is it? And so I go to this Macau website, and all right, let's go and put in like a 4-bedroom apartment in Macau. How much does that cost? Yeah, it's like $6,000 a month. So it's like, all right, that's the size that you would need in order to comfortably have a sizable family. And that's really expensive. To go and say that people are spending $1,000 a month for a shoebox, therefore housing prices are fine, is just a really weird thing to say. Right now, when people go and look at, let me back up. So when people are doing the actual statistical work trying to say that density per se is important, as far as I can tell, they never have actual prices.
Right.
So they're missing the main reason why you would have high density. I mean, and actually, if you read more closely, a lot of it doesn't even have anything better than national average density. So if you believe this, would be like people in Moscow have lots of kids because Siberia is part of their country.
Right.
And it's like, well, I think you want to have a more local measure than that anyway. You don't want to do it at the national level. But if you keep going down to a smaller and smaller level, eventually it says, well, how about we just do square foot of housing per person? And square feet of housing per person, that is something where obviously the price is crucial. Again, there's one guy who just said the sense of no, it's the tallness per se. It's like, so you're telling me that if we had a 100-story building where each floor was 5,000 square feet and each floor was for one family, that would go, and just knowing you're in this really tall building and that there's people above and below you would cause you to have very few kids.
Yeah.
Like, it's not impossible, but it's a really weird story. And from what I can tell, none of the evidence they put forward says anything other than the obvious thing that people live in dense housing when housing's expensive.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me. I think that makes a lot of sense, and it strikes me as one, an aesthetic preference, and then two, this kind of like over extrapolating from like the personal experience where people move out to the burbs to have kids and so on, which is largely like a budget led decision. So like it goes back to your point.
Well, although it's also a selection effect, right? So this is another reason why you shouldn't think the density per se reduces fertility. It's like, well, why do you live in a downtown area? Because you don't have kids. Right. If you wanted to have kids, it's very standard to change where you're living based upon your family circumstance. It works. Normally, we think about young people, they have kids, so they leave the city. But the other one is elderly people who are empty nesters will often move back to the city because now they don't need the space and now they want some urban amenities. So that's another reason why at least the raw correlation is overstating the causation. But again, like the main thing to focus on is price. Like, what can you get for that money? Don't just say it costs $1,000. What do you get for $1,000?
Within the Panacea policy framework, so all these positive effects in terms of labor mobility, people being able to move from, let's say, low productivity regions to high productivity regions, if housing is not a barrier, fertility, environmental benefits, like if you could live in close walking or cycling or transit distance from your work, you're burning less carbon and all this other good stuff. But I think ultimately, like the big one is that like the impact of making it easier to build more housing in those parts of the country that people want to live, how that impacts economic growth and ultimately GDP. And there was a very impactful paper by, I think it was
Shane Moretti. Yes.
Shane Moretti. Could you tell us a little bit about that paper, including, I know there were some like controversies around some of it, but like, so I guess like the paper itself specifically, but this broader idea that if we care about economic growth and productivity and rising standards of living and all this stuff, this might be, again, like the panacea policy, this might be like the one thing we really want to focus on.
Right. So the logic of the paper is pretty simple. It just says, look, we've got some really high productivity areas of the country and some really low productivity areas of the country. And it's not primarily that the people who live in the Bay Area are so much better than similarly educated people who live in Texas, say. Rather, it's just that the Bay Area economy has special management or special technology or whatever special sauce it's got. Right. So anyway, this is the premise that you could actually take people from low productivity areas of the country, move them to high productivity areas of the country, and they would then produce more. Right? I mean, this is really obvious. You just think about, say, nuclear engineer who lives as a hermit in the desert.
Right.
It's like, all right, what's he going to do? He's going to he's going to catch lizards and farm cacti. So that guy, it's like, well, he has his incredible skills, but he's in the wrong place to actually make use of them. So if he stays there, he's going to have really low productivity. If he moves to an area with a nuclear plant, he'll have much higher productivity. So that's the first premise, is that there are these big differences in productivity by area of the country, and this is not just an illusion. This is real. Second point is that the high productivity countries normally make it really hard to build stuff, which means that people don't move there. That's the second part. So the nuclear physicist might stay out in the desert if to go and move to the place where he'd be producing $200,000 more in value per year, he had to pay $300,000 more in cost of living. Right. So if we can go and deregulate, get housing costs down, then that is going to lead people to move to places primarily based upon their productivity rather than productivity minus this cost of living. So anyway, this is the premise of the paper. And then it's like a lot of papers published in top econ journals, is a pile of math that most people would be completely baffled by. But yeah, the paper got national attention because they came up with a really large number for how much GDP would rise if you were to go and deregulate. And in particular, the memorable thought experiment they had is, if the Bay Area and New York City had just stayed at the normal level of housing regulation for the United States, then US GDP would be between 4 and 9% higher for the whole country. So basically, if we imagine going back in time and we prevent the Bay Area and New York City from screwing up their housing markets, the country overall would be 4 to 9% richer. All right, so that's what the paper said, got a lot of attention, very exciting. But when I was writing my book, I went through the paper really closely and I noticed what appeared to be some basic arithmetic errors. And then my first inclination is, problem's me, I made a mistake. So I emailed the authors and they wrote me back and they were very upfront and they said, no, actually, Bryan, you're right. We did make these basic arithmetic errors. Sorry. So I then went and recalculated. And when you recalculate, then the estimate gets huge. Like really big.
Okay, it's even better.
Yeah. So it's like, well, okay. So they weren't just deliberately
exaggerating.
Yeah, exaggerating. It was not, the mistake did not seem motivated in order to go and get a result that was more exciting for themselves. So that sounded pretty good. All right. So anyway, then I wrote it up for my book talking about this. But then very soon before we were going to print, there's another economist, Brian Greene, who went and published a piece saying he found some much more fundamental errors in the paper, such that if he's right, then the mistakes I caught are, I'm correcting mistakes built on other piles of mistakes, so I didn't really accomplish anything. So on my blog, I let Shay go and respond, because on this one, they are not saying that Greene is right. And then Greene responded again. People who are smart and don't have a dog in the fight that I've talked to, almost all of them think that Greene's right and that Shay Amretti screwed up. I don't know what the final decision will be. But interestingly enough, coincidentally, today I was working on doing what economists call back of the napkin version of this, right? Or I guess it's back of the envelope, or a napkin estimate. I should, that's right. I'm mixing my metaphors. Anyway, I just wanted to make it way simpler than they did and say, all right, just imagine that we go and move people from poor states in the U.S. to rich states, and then match them by their education, and then what fraction would move, and then how much would the gains be? So anyway, I'm not done with that, but after going through those basic numbers, what I'll say is that the very lowest end of Shay Moretti might be correct, but that's about all that I'll go for at this point. So I think that they did wind up overstating quite a bit, and when I corrected them correctly, but in a direction that wound up leading a result that's actually just too optimistic. So what I say in the book is that when you're making the case for housing deregulation, it makes sense to me to start with the most basic, undeniable thing. And that is step one. We got estimates of how much cheaper housing would be if you could build whatever you wanted. And I think there it's really plausible that housing prices would fall by 50% or more. Let's say 50% to make it easy and conservative, and combine this with typical share Americans spend on shelter, which is about 20% of their budget. And it's like, well, if we go and cut the price of 20% of your budget in half, this is the same as cutting your cost of living by 10%, which is the same as raising your standard of living by 11%. And I think that's really all you need. You don't need anything fancier to see that this is a huge issue with big consequences.
Yeah. Okay. So if we accept that it's a big issue with huge consequences, and that if we were to resolve resolve this issue, it would have benefits far beyond just you paying less for housing. So this kind of like begs the question, like, what do we do about this? So maybe if you could speak on that, and then specifically, you have this concept that I think you first introduced in the Open Borders book of Keyhole Solutions. Why it doesn't maybe have to be all or nothing given the political constraints. I think there's this saying that politics is the art of the possible. So what are Keyhole Solutions? And given how important this is, how good it would be for America, for Canada, for the world if this were resolved, what do we do?
Yeah, all good questions. So Keyhole Solutions, I have this concept from economic journalist Tim Harford. It's a medical analogy. So in medicine, doctors used to do some really horrible things to solve horrible problems, but the methods they're using have such bad side effects that you have to wonder whether it was worth doing in the first place. Over time, they have tried to be more mindful of side effects and harm to the patient and to do smaller things that accomplish the same result, right? So rather than do a really big incision, can you do a small incision and then work within this little space, the size of a keyhole, and get it in. So that's actually the origin of the idea. Like, you just cut a keyhole-sized hole in a person, and then you stick your camera in, and then you're like, hey, we'll just go and work microscopically, and then pull it out, and then we barely done anything. A very easy to visualize example of this is what C-sections used to be like versus what they're like now. Mm-hmm. Used to be you'd cut vertically. It's like, right? And that's, that's a pretty bad thing to do, and with very severe recovery. Now they cut a horizontal cut, a smaller cut, still gets the baby out, but complications, side effects, and just pain and suffering a lot less. All right. So Hartford said similarly, when you're thinking about government handling a problem, it makes sense to be very mindful of, well, is there some cheaper, more humane way of doing this? Classic example in economics would be what to do about air pollution. Normal human being wants to write a book of regulations that thick. But economists have been saying, how about we have no regulations and we just say there's a tax if you want to go and pollute? And then why would anyone ever cut back their pollution? To pay less taxes, mm-hmm. right? And what are the benefits of this approach? First of all, it encourages people who can reduce pollution cheaply to do so, while allowing people who can only reduce it at a high cost to continue to do it. Second thing is it creates a incentive for innovation. If you can come up with a way that reduces the cost of reducing pollution, you don't need to convince the government to require it. Business facing these taxes will be very quick to say, oh, wait, this new technology reduces pollution. That'll reduce my tax bill. Fantastic. Sign me up for 3. All right, so that's a good example of a Keyhole solution generally. In my book, Open Borders and Immigration, I say things like, look, if you're really worried about immigrants going and being a burden on taxpayers, how about say they can come, but they're now eligible for benefits for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years or whatever you want to say. All right. So in the housing book, a lot of what I propose is, how about instead of saying no, you just say, here's a price list. If you want to go and build your skyscraper, here's how much you have to pay. Mm-hmm. And if you pay the price, you can start building it now. You can start today. Right. The way that in the real world, a lot of regulation works is that you might know that after 5 years you get permission, but it's going to take 5 years and the opponent's going to drag it out. And in dragging it out, they'll often make it not worth doing. And so you give up. If you could just say, all right, fine. There's 3 bird's nests in this area. What's the bird nest fee again? $3,000 a nest. All right, here's $9,000 check. All right, now I never have to hear about this again. Go away. All right. Now, in terms of what can be done about it, there's a lot of economists and also people who know some basic economics who just say this is hopeless because most voters own their own homes and they're never going to vote for anything that reduces the value of their homes. Sounds true, but we got a lot of data saying that's completely wrong. And actually, almost everybody supports housing regulation regardless of whether they rent or own. It's not about protecting your home. It's about doing what you think is best for society on the basis of a political philosophy. Mm-hmm. It might not be a very thoughtful political philosophy, might be half-baked or quarter-baked, but the general fact about almost all political arguments is that they are actually about some kind of ideological or philosophical difference. It's not really about how can I get the most money for myself or how can I protect my self-interest. I've had people say, oh, but housing is different because it's so obvious that housing deregulation hurts your housing prices. It's like, first of all, only 1 person in 3 even agrees that increasing supply reduces prices. But anyway, do you know what's even more obvious in terms of how it affects your self-interest? Like high tax parties are bad for rich people and low tax parties are good for rich people. And now think about all the rich people you know and how they vote.
Right.
And it's like, yeah. So if self-interest does not lead rich Americans, Canadians to go and vote for the lower tax party reliably, and it totally doesn't, then the idea that there's something special about housing where self-interest is going to rule the roost is just silly. And we've got data and it's just not true. So why do people actually favor housing regulation? They favor it because they think the world will be worse without it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why a lot of my book is just trying to change their minds about it and say, look, you think it's worse, but have you considered all of these benefits? There's a lot of good things that you're not really taking into account. And also a lot of it is you're just being really stubborn about denying that building more stuff will reduce prices, right? Isn't that just a silly and dogmatic position? Like if you're running a lemonade stand and someone said, hey, we could sell more if we cut our price, would you say, oh, that's just some right-wing nonsense? It's not right-wing nonsense to think that cutting the price of lemonade will get to sell more lemonade. It's fact. It's common sense. It's fact. Anyone who thinks otherwise is like, what planet are you on? And the same thing goes for housing. If you want it to be cheaper, you've got to let builders build more of it. Now, in terms of how to change people's minds, I do think it's really helpful just to realize what the problem is. So stop assuming that it's just greedy homeowners who are being hard to deal with. And honestly, I'll say like that would be a much better scenario than the one we're in. Because if it were just greed, we could write them checks to shut them up.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just like, look, builder wants to build here. No, bad. What's it going to take to make this problem go away? $13,000 each, 12, and you got a deal. All right, fine, 12, done. All right. But that's not the way the world is. Instead, it's ideological, it's philosophical. People think there's some big moral principles involved. And so to say, look, the philosophy is based upon a bunch of false ideas about the world. Now, as to how you can tell people that and not have them hate you, this is one of the big questions that absorbs my thinking. I'm a big fan of Andrew Carnegie and makes a pretty obvious point. Nobody cares what you know until they know that you care. If you want to be persuasive to people, step one is to be their friend. Smile, be friendly. A lot of people that I talk to are economists, and like, we got to make the arguments better. And like, the arguments are really good. We got to make our delivery better. Right. And I will say, like, I say this not because I think I'm the most awesome bringer of bad tidings or anything else. This is partly why I do a graphic novel. Is in the graphic novel, I'm always the best version of me.
Sure.
Like in conversation, I'll have the wrong tone. I'll say the wrong thing, right? Use a word that upsets somebody. But in the graphic novel, it's all choreographed down to the level of, I tell my artist, make me look 3% more sad here. And he does it. So that way I can, in imagination, be the most effective spokesman for these ideas that I can be, although way better than I am in real life.
Well, on that note, let me just put the cover on screen. So this is the book. I didn't think about.
You gotta be. Yeah, there you are. Good, perfect.
Okay, yes. So Build Baby Build: The Science and Ethics of Housing Regulation. I was actually talking to my wife about this, whether like if we gave this to my mother-in-law or like her sister, like people who are not that into this issue, like how they would react. And I think the only way to run that experiment is to run that experiment.
Yeah.
So I do think that everybody should buy this book, but not only buy this book, but you should buy it and gift it to someone. And maybe the person who is most skeptical of land use liberalization. I have this other idea that I've discovered working with a lot of policymakers and politicians. I think most people underrate just how much power a like 27-year-old political staffer has, both at the municipal level.
Right.
And so like giving these books to those people, I think is a good idea.
And especially I would think about giving it to people who are young. Right. So like all of my books, I try to write not just for professors or researchers. I want to reach a bigger audience. But when I do a graphic novel, then even 5-year-olds are reading it. Yeah. And I think that is a big win. Right? They're not getting everything, but I think that they are getting the gist of it. So yeah, like the odds of changing the minds of a person who's 60, like it happens, but it's really rare. But to go and give these books to kids, I think that this is about as likely to get them reading it and change their mind as anything you can imagine giving them on the issue anyway.
Yeah. Well, no, it's interesting. Just before this recording, I was actually at City Hall here in Toronto. There's a motion to allow for 6-story buildings on major streets throughout the city. This would be a major win for kind of the YIMBY cause. And you get these deputants who show up to speak in favor of the motion or in opposition to the motion. And if I think I'm remembering something, but every single person who was opposed to it, I would estimate as being 50 plus. Yeah. And every single person who was in favor of it, I would estimate at 40 or under.
Yes.
And you see this like at public meetings for specific development applications or like these broader policy discussions. And with again, you mentioned YIMBYism as kind of like a wing of the progressive left. I see kind of like this, again, this cross-partisan, cross-ideological consensus.
It's great if it is. So like Prove me wrong, kids.
with different emphasis, right?
Yeah.
Like different emphasis and certainly different language. But I do think that is encouraging. But before we wrap this up, on this question of what do you do about it, I think about policy responses as falling into one or two potential buckets. So in Tokyo, there was like a major housing affordability crisis. I believe it was in the late 80s, early 90s, and one of the big response to that crisis was to nationalize land use planning. So land use planning is set by the national government, not by the municipal government. So it's somewhat removed from this local political calculus, the NIMBY veto and all these things. And it's been successful to the extent that Tokyo land use regulation is a lot less constraining than, let's say, Manhattan land use regulation. So that's one. That's kind of like the top down. You just need the Nayib Bukele or whatever, like strongman leader to just do the right thing all at once. And then another category.
Fingers crossed.
Right. Yeah.
Fingers crossed the strong man does something good instead of something terrible.
So fair. So maybe we'll keep that, and then I'll talk about the second bucket, and then maybe weigh the pros and cons, and then I guess Malay is another one who we might have in this first category. But there was a policy paper released by, again, a British think tank whose name I forget. It was this idea of smart streets, where it's based on this premise that people do have these property value motivations in opposing new development sometimes. And what you could do is, if you allow a hyper local, you basically like hyper localize, instead of uploading land use regulation, you hyper localize it so that one street could vote on upzoning itself. And if you could convince like 3 out of your 5 neighbors to upzone yourself, then that happens. And you can make the case that, hey guys, if we upzone ourselves and someone builds a high-rise building here, we could all make a lot of money. And the Works in Progress magazine wrote about Israel, and Tel Aviv, I think specifically, has adopted a version of this where it's not top down, it's not the Nayib Bukele or the Japanese national government. It's just like empowering at a extremely local level, like a small band of motivated neighbors who want to make a bunch of money and move out to the burbs or whatever to like upzone themselves on the way out. So how do you think about these two categories?
I mean, they're both promising. Like, I would just say try whatever you can, honestly. I mean, like, as to which one will actually work better, I don't know. Like the main thing I think about for almost all persuasion is everybody's got a comparative advantage. So I do graphic novels. I don't think I'd be very good at testifying in a local meeting or something like that. I think I would probably have negative efficacy, where I would talk and people would say, God, I hate that guy. I can't believe what he's saying. So like, on the other hand, other people are really good at things like that. So I don't have any strong opinion on what the best way forward there is. It's more of take what I can get, and like, it's just judge things by the results, not by some general principle of it's always better to be local or not.
Sure. And I guess in either scenario, your odds are improved if more people agree with the benefits that you're outlining here.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. So with that said, again, one more plug for Build Baby Build, which you could buy on Amazon or anywhere that great books are sold. And yeah, thank you once again for joining the podcast.
Right.
Really enjoyed the conversation.
Fantastic being here.